2024 was the year of the BART speedrun. The world record was broken 4 times, many strategies that were thought to be impossible were successfully performed, and BART themselves are officially in on the act, as they've begun to acknowledge the speedrunning community. It's been a real honor for me to be part of this history, but many in the BART community believe that the record is extremely optimized now. However, in BART's sister metro system, on the other side of the continent, the speedrun competition is heating up. The community is full of passionate runners who have been working tirelessly to find every single possible way to optimize the record. But oh boy, if you thought the BART speedrun was complex, the DC Metro speedrun is on a whole other level. There are so many viable strategies, so many ways it can go wrong, and so many attempts that have just about come short to breaking records. I've been following this competition for months now, and I'm very excited to see how it develops in the coming year. And I think it's one that you should know about as well. This is the history of Washington Metro speedruns. If you're watching this video and you're new to my channel, or just transit YouTube in general, but you clicked on this video because you like speedrunning, you might be wondering, what? How do you speedrun a metro system? How does that even work? There is plenty of debate around the rules and standards for this competition type, but the most basic premise is that you have to ride to every single metro station on the system as fast as possible. It's been going on for longer than you think, with the challenge originating in the 60s in London and New York. But recently, with the rise of gaming speedruns, some people have begun to adapt the term to this particular genre of competition. Anyway, back to Washington, DC. The metro network here is huge, but the basics can be seen from this map. Within downtown DC, there are 3 main city center tunnels, and in the suburbs into Virginia and Maryland, there are a total of 10 distinct branches. But this map doesn't tell you the full story. This one's a lot better. You can get a feel for just how far west the Silver Line goes. And because of that, every single run that we will look at in this video either starts at Ashburn or ends at Ashburn. And now, you have to figure out the best order to knock out the other 9 branches. And if you look at the numbers naively, it might startle you at first, because the number of ways to arrange 9 objects is 9 factorial, which is 9 times 8 times 7 down to 1. But then you have to double this number, because runs that start at Ashburn and runs that end at Ashburn are separate. So the naive number of possible DC Metro speedruns, assuming Ashburn's the start or end, is nearly 750,000. But I think it goes without saying that a majority of the routes you can come up with randomly are going to be pretty bad. And don't worry, there's no more math in this video, I just wanted to give you a sense of scale. Anyway, here are the common practices that most runs will employ. The Huntington branch is part of the Franconia branch, so they should be visited right after each other. The same goes for Vienna, which is very close to the Ashburn branch, which means that Vienna is either always the second or second last branch, depending on whether you start or end at Ashburn respectively. The Green Line is pretty close into the city, so it's often done in the middle of runs, not the beginning or end. The 2 eastmost branches, New Carrollton and Largo, have buses between them, and that is often used in runs. And now all that leaves to consider is the Red Line, the most unique line on the network. The line has a rather fascinating shape. It's a large U shape, with the individual legs not being too far apart, so taking a bus between them is a viable strategy, though the Shady Grove leg is a bit longer than the Glenmont leg. Not only that, but the Glenmont leg has a convenient transfer to the Green Line at Fort Totten. So another common strategy is to ride the Green Line in its entirety, backtrack at Greenbelt, change to the red at Fort Totten, then ride to Glenmont, and then turn back and end the run at Shady Grove. The Red Line is also great because it is completely separate from the other 5 lines, which means it is the least affected by delays on the system, and it also runs at the highest frequency. You came here to see some world records, right? So let's dive in at last. Public acknowledgement of records before recently has been very limited. There's an account on Twitter called the DC Metro Challenge, but they haven't posted in nearly a decade. They don't even have the Silver Line in their profile photo, and their website associated with the account is dead. You can find some blog posts and tweets from around this era of people attempting runs, but it seemed like some extreme internet niche at the time. Also, in the past, it seemed like they were a bit stricter on whether or not you could ride buses in the record attempts, but today that's almost always accepted. But needless to say, nobody really knew what the world record was at the time. So, when you want to know about a world record, who do you turn to find that information? Regrettably, Guinness. The record on file with Guinness is 7 hours and 59 minutes, achieved by Scott Bennett in 2019. However, this run was performed before the Ashburn part of the Silver Line opened, so it's no longer accepted by the community. Normally, when the transit system opens new stations, the record for the speedrun of the system resets. However, since Guinness can be difficult to deal with sometimes, and they won't accept your run unless you provide the most elaborate proof known to humanity, and a couple $100, they are still yet to honor a new record. That being said, Scott's time of 7:59 would prove to be quite ominous. Obviously, with 6 new stations being open, you'd think the record would end up being longer than 8 hours. Scott's time would still be the one to break though, even with more stations. Could the DC Metro speedrunners pull it off? Or was sub 8 just a relic of the past? Let's find out. The first person to perform a speedrun following the Ashburn extension, and thus the record holder by default, was Lucas Wall, a travel vlogger from the area. This run was done in November 2022, literally the very next day after the line opened. As you'd expect, Lucas started at Ashburn, then took care of Vienna via East Falls Church. After that, he headed back into central DC on the Orange Line, changing to the red at Metro Center. He then went all the way out to Shady Grove, got on a bus to Glenmont, then cleared the rest of the red line through to Gallery Place, and then would spend nearly 2 hours back and forth on the Green Line. He first went up to Greenbelt, down to Branch Avenue, and finally back to the mega interchange of L'Enfant Plaza. Next was the Orange Line to New Carrollton, but this is where things would turn sour. Lucas planned to take a bus, whose operator is literally called The Bus. It would get him to Largo, but it showed up 17 minutes behind schedule. Despite that significant delay, it was still a tiny bit faster than taking a train back to Stadium Armory and getting to Largo from there. Once he reached Largo though, everything was relatively back to normal. He rode the entire Blue Line to Franconia Springfield, then finally ended at Huntington with a time of 8 hours and 54 minutes. Overall, his run was pretty solid, with no major hindrances. But more than anything, it was a starting point, just to prove that a speedrun was possible. But one speedrun is never enough. There would always be a chance to improve. There was a sense that this time could be beaten, with a better ordering of the branches, and maybe a trick or two up the sleeve of an ingenious transit runner. And 2 months later, one such runner would come forward. Claire Aguayo, aka Floppa, was the next person to enter the ring. Her video of the run that we're about to analyze got pretty popular on YouTube and raised awareness of the idea of Metro speedrunning. She's since gone on to develop a community of fellow runners. But first, of course, she had to beat Lucas Wall. Claire's run started on a wet January morning at Ashburn, and would be business as usual until Rosslyn. This is where she would deviate from Lucas's route, going to Franconia first before the red line. Everything was going well at first until a rather annoying delay struck on the line back up from Huntington, which slowed her down by over 20 minutes in the end. It was a tough pill to swallow, but the show must go on. Next, it was the turn of the red line, and Claire would go to Shady Grove, then nick a bus to Glenmont. At Fort Totten, with the red line still incomplete, she would now get onto the green and start knocking off the stations on that line. And this is where her biggest play would come forward. The green line is where Claire would use her third bus of the run, and it's the sneakiest one yet. This one doesn't stop at the terminal stations of the metro lines, instead at the intermediate stations, which means that you have to go back and forth to collect the stations that you missed in between. When Claire got to Addison Road, there were 2 of these stations on the blue and silver line that she had to go get, but because of her delay, she had to prioritize getting the bus between Largo and New Carrollton because the bus stops running at around 7 p.m. So she prioritized the bus, then went back and did a rather annoying maneuver to get those 2 extra stations, and finally ended the run on the red line with the 4 stops that she missed earlier, getting off at Brooklyn with a time of 8 hours and 36 minutes on the watch. It was a bit painful, not entirely smooth, but all that matters is that she now had the record. Claire's routing was actually pretty impressive, with not a lot of stations being double counted, and had that blue line delay not hit her, she could have been looking at a time around 8:10 to 8:15. But when you ride trains for as long as you do in the DC Metro speedrun, delays are almost a guarantee, and you should be prepared for the absolute worst to happen. The amount of attempts that have broken down over the years due to delays is enough to make your eyes weep. And there's a reason for all of this. The DC Metro in 2009 disabled their automatic train operation following a crash. and this has made the system slower and much less reliable ever since. Delays now often feel like an expected inevitability rather than a rare inconvenience. And while Metro has intended to bring back automation very soon, there is no word on when that's going to happen yet. And this fatal flaw affects everyone who rides the DC Metro, from office commuters to college students and just people who wish to live car light. And of course, for our purposes, speedrunners. With the amount of attention that Claire's run got on YouTube, as well as local news outlets, many would be inspired to try and break her record. But in May of 2023, something would happen that would be pivotal in the record's progression, as a new station was added to the system. You may have noticed that the map that we referenced earlier had a station labeled as a future station, namely Potomac Yard. Well, it finally opened for service in May, which increased the number of stations from 97 to 98. With this opening, two things would happen. Firstly, the nearby neighborhoods with a lot of mixed-use development could now benefit from a direct metro connection right at their doorstep. But also, since a new station was added to the system, Claire's record from January was no more. I'll let you decide which of those two things is more important. While an infill station, which is to say a station that opens between existing ones, shouldn't affect the record by too much, common rules of transit speedrunning dictate that any new station render previous records null and void, infill or extension. It's also worth noting that over the past couple years, train frequencies have gradually been improving. As you might know, a little something happened in 2020 that caused a huge reduction in the amount of people commuting to work, and transit agencies were struggling with little ridership. While Metro isn't still at pre-pandemic levels just yet, it's getting there, slowly but surely. And of course, the more frequently trains run, the quicker transfers can be made, which is all great news for speedrunners. So, with more frequent trains and a clean slate on the leaderboard, the race was on to see who would take the crown anew. Would it be Lucas or Claire from before? They want to reclaim their glory, but a new competitor was waiting in the wings this time. And this right here was a golden opportunity to cement his name into DC Metro folklore. And his name was Zach Lincoln. Zach is a proud Virginia native transit fan who made it his mission to become the first to post a 98 station run. His strategy was something completely unseen in previous records. Instead of starting at Ashburn, he would end there. The route started in Franconia and the Huntington sector, then did the bus between New Carrollton and Largo, followed by the whole Green Line, the whole Red Line, then finally to Vienna and Ashburn. Zach's pace was truly insane, with tight transfer after tight transfer succeeding. But he wasn't done yet, he still had one more trick. This trick goes by many names, but I like to call it the Farragut Long Jump, or FLJ. The normal place to transfer from the red to the orange, blue, and silver lines is Metro Center, but the two Farragut stations, north and west, are close enough to each other you can leave one station, travel on foot to the other, and you won't be charged extra for doing so. If the timing is in your favor, and you run fast enough, doing an FLJ can save you a few minutes. But you have to make sure that you get Metro Center and McPherson Square later in your run. Or in Zach's case, he already got them earlier. After the FLJ, it was a straight shot towards the record. And despite a hiccup near Rosslyn that prevented sub 8 from being a possibility, 8:18 was more than enough to beat both records from the pre-Potomac Yard era. But going into the summer, with school out, there would be plenty of time for new attempts to be made. July 2023 was quite an eventful month for DC Metro speedrunning, especially on the week of the 17th. On that Monday morning, a few new runners would take to the field. And these weren't your average everyday transit speedrunners. These were advanced transit speedrunners. Hugh, Benjamin, and another Benjamin were University of Chicago students that previously rode a speedrun on the Chicago L system. Much like the Washington Metro, the Chicago L is extremely radial, with faraway branches but on a much larger scale. Taking buses between the branches is even more important in Chicago than it is in DC. Immediately, you notice a change of tack from these runners. They were outside normally, from Ashburn, but this time they would ride the whole Orange Line through to New Carrollton in one go. They figured that since the bus is the least frequent vehicle in the entire run, you may as well knock it out as soon as possible. From there, with a bit of good fortune, they made the Blue Line and turned to complete Franconia Springfield and Huntington, and snuck out of Virginia using this tiny spur of Yellow Line track that to date we haven't seen used in a record speedrun. Because there's no stations on this track, it's not required to be used. But it is a first. This gave them a faster connection to the Green Line though at L'Enfant Plaza, which they doubled back on twice ahead of the victory lap on the red line. A bump at Glenmont, followed by riding the entire red line to Shady Grove. The world record was now theirs, but would it breach the hallowed Scott Bennett milestone of under 8 hours? Nope, not quite. To be fair to them, their projected time according to schedules was over 8 hours. By avoiding any major delays, they finished within 1 minute of their projection. Needless to say, a sub 8 would have been a little bit unlikely, but this run was still a massive feat, and it introduced a new philosophy to the DC speedrunning discourse. Their run completed the silver, orange, and blue lines first, the 3 least frequent lines in the system. They also backtracked a lot and used only 1 bus, with most previous runs using 2 or even 3. The total number of trains and buses they rode was only 13, compared to 18 on Zach's record and 21 on Claire's. Time spent transferring between trains or waiting for a bus is time spent not moving, which isn't great. As Hugh put it, trains are simply faster than buses. It turns out there's a reason why so many speedrun attempts were happening in this week of July. The Metro was about to close some stations temporarily for some track work, and you obviously can't speedrun in those conditions. But a few days after Team U Chicago ran, Claire was back, and this time she too brought a team. Running alongside her were Ryan and Troot. They were confident that this would be the run, the first ever sub 8 in the post-Ashburn DC Metro history. The route they were set to follow was scheduled for 7:57. The run was being led by someone who'd done it all before. The stage was set for history to be made. So then, at 11 a.m. on Thursday, July 20th, 2023, this happened. Claire and friends missed the train they wanted out of Greenbelt, which trapped them there for another few minutes, and that would happen again when they turned back at Glenmont. All that lost time had proved to be crucial, as they finished with a time of 8:09:55, nearly 6 minutes off the record, and of course failing to breach sub 8. A gut-wrenching end to what was poised to be an incredible moment. The very next day, Friday the 21st, there'd be time for one more attempt before the closures. This would come from Lucas again, who, despite confidently boasting that he got the record on his website, hadn't done his homework, as his final time, 8:20, was behind both of the week's prior attempts and 4th place overall. But anyway, with track work going on for a couple months, the DC Metro speedrun would go into a bit of hibernation, with the record standing at just over 8 hours and the hope that trains would run more smoothly and reliably following the maintenance, and the fact that a sub 8 hour run was actually found in schedules. Many expected that this run would be able to be performed in just a matter of time. Everything was being studied. The bus connections with the least possible wait, the exact cars to be in, and even doors to stand in front of to be best positioned for transfers and exits. But most of all, if someone was going to break 8 hours, they would need a bit of luck. The meta route was as set in stone as it can get. Many runs would start at Ashburn, and if doing so, you have 4 steps before finishing Vienna. There's the Franconia and Huntington sector, the NC Largo bump with the bus in the east, traversing the entire green line, and finally traversing the entire red line. There are a couple of valid orders in which to perform these 4 steps, but the order that I read them out was the most common. However, starting at Ashburn was just one option. Zach Lincoln's strategy was to end at Ashburn. This would seem start at Franconia, do the 4 steps from the previous section in the same order, then backtrack at Shady Grove, do an FLJ, and head to Vienna and Ashburn. But with all that track work going on and finally concluding, who would be the first to try a sub 8? At 7 a.m. on September 25th, up stepped Alex, aka DC Transpo, alongside his friend Owly. They started at Ashburn and had a brief scare already at Vienna. When they arrived, the next train to depart had its doors closing. They were about to agonizingly miss the train, but in a stroke of kindness, the operator reopened the doors just for them. Doubling back at the end of the line is surely only a thing that speedrunners would do, right? And now it was time for step 1, the Franconia sector. They chose to go to Huntington first with a quick change from blue to yellow, and when getting to Huntington, they would encounter a very tight bump there too. Franconia would have a similarly tight bump, but third time is the devil in this case, as Alex and Owly would not have good fortune and missed it by a minute. This costed them 12 minutes overall on the run and meant that step 2, the bus from Largo to NC, was no longer the next best move. So they chose to do step 3, the Green Line traversal, first. They tried to get the P12 bus to save time, but it too was off schedule, and now meant the fastest way to travel from Largo to NC was not the bus, but backtracking at Stadium Armory. And once they got to NC, it was yet another near miss. At this point, world record pace was a long shot. Of course, the Green Line is still not done, so it's up the Greenbelt, down to Fort Totten, and winding around the Red Line to the end. Unfortunately, despite coming really close in the end, the final time was short of a record, and of course, short of 8 hours as well. This is easily the most unlucky speedrun that we've seen so far, with so many near misses and 2 last-minute strategy shifts. And with all that, it was still pretty admirable how close they came to the record in the end. But all that mattered was that yet another attempt had fallen short at the hands of the delay gods. 8 hours would still not be breached. It was like something that had to be protected. That the Guinness record must remain. It must stand the test of time forever, and no one will ever touch it. But speedrunners don't give up that easily. As long as a route is possible, it must be executed. And it would seem like, despite all the new contenders, the responsibility would circle back to Zach Lincoln. He's no stranger to firsts, of course, as he was the first one to post a run following Potomac Yard's opening, but now he could achieve an even better first. Recall that in his previous run, he said that he would be out for revenge. And now, into December, he had to go and fulfill that promise by the end of the year. There was something quite poetic about his first run, in that it started in Virginia and ended also in Virginia, which is Zach's home state, an allegiance to which he never hides. So obviously, he had to do that same route again, and here is what happened. The final time on the watch was 7 hours, 40 minutes, and 5 seconds. At last, just over a year after the Ashburn extension opened, a sub-8 had been performed. Scott Bennett's holding that distinction was no more. And it wasn't just sub-8, it was nearly 20 whole minutes off. This is the greatest Washington Metro speedrun ever performed in the modern era. It was a monumental achievement, and it still is. Because almost a year on, at the time of this video's release, Zach still holds the record. 2024 saw a couple more attempts that eclipsed 8 hours, even though the record still hasn't been broken. First up, Alex and Owly had another go in April. Their run didn't necessarily contain any new strategies, more just optimizing existing ones. Nonetheless, it was still quite a roller coaster of emotions. Tight turnarounds made, tight transfers missed, more bad bus luck, but most of all, a spirit to finish the run, world record or not. In the end, despite all their issues, they still finished with a very impressive 7:43, just a stone's throw away from Zach. The next month in May, we get a duo representing another Rust Belt university, this time Michigan. Adam and Owen, who were also humor sportscasters, followed in Zach's strategy and starting at Franconia and ending at Ashburn, but they had a couple new plays to bring to the table. Instead of taking the bus from NC to Largo, there was another one from NC to Greenbelt, the 15X. If performed successfully, using this bus could incur a massive time save. But there's only one problem. This bus is super difficult to catch, only running during peak hours at a frequency of every 45 minutes. So after Huntington, they remained on the Blue Line through to Largo, backtracked to Benning Road, then ran to Minnesota Avenue, hoping for a faster transfer rather than waiting at Stadium Armory. This too was the first ever in a speedrun attempt. Fortunately, they made the 15X at New Carrollton, then it was straight to Greenbelt, down the entire Green Line, back to Gallery Place, and business as usual from here. Train to Glenmont, bus to Twinbrook, Shady Grove Bump, Red Line Descent, FLJ, but unfortunately, the delay gods had been silent for most of this run, but they would come out to play in the final stretches. That killed their shot at a world record, but still did enough to get them over the dotted line and achieve the third ever sub-8, knocking U Chicago off the podium positions in the process. The DC Metro speedrunning community is still alive and well, and there's plenty of positivity that the record can go even lower in the months to come. Despite seeming very strong and unassailable, the first and second place runs both weren't perfect. In particular, Alex's run was looking at around the 720s if everything went according to plan. Josh Does Travel recently attempted a run that was scheduled to take only 7:15, but it failed. And this is all before automatic train operation returns. Metro riders and fans alike have been waiting for this to happen for ages, and whenever it does, I'm sure there will be a rush of new speedrun attempts. Sub 8 was always thought of as the ultimate milestone, but could we now be realistically thinking about sub 7? You know what they say about speedrunning, just when you think a record is truly impossible to be beaten, someone will always find a way to beat it. Before I end the video, there is one more speedrun attempt that I want to talk about that happened in 2024. The focus is not on their route or their final time, because their run meant a lot more than just the run. Cody, Shungwon, and Jason set off to have a go at the world record, of course, but their main goal was to interview riders and spread awareness of WMATA's looming budget crisis and the proposed cuts that they would impose should they fail to secure funding for another fiscal year. Fortunately, they did secure that funding in the end, but I still found it really special to get to hear a bunch of accounts from riders of many different backgrounds. The interviews as well as the speedrun were arranged in a podcast, and a link is provided in the description of this video. First and foremost, speedrunning transit is a fun competition, but it's also a great way to get a feel of the people that rely on public transit and what it means to them. You are by definition going through the entire system while speedrunning, and you get to experience every single community and neighborhood that is served by the system. In the case of DC, that includes tons of transit-oriented development, something that other American cities can only dream of. It is not an exaggeration to say that Metro is the heart and soul of this rapidly growing urban area, and long may that continue. Thanks for watching.